China's leader Xi Jinping is continuing his high-profile state visit to Russia, where he's been warmly greeted as an old friend by President Putin. Beijing's billed this visit as a trip for peace. Mr. Putin said that Moscow was always open to negotiation. But the Americans have already warned that China's negotiation plan on Ukraine could be just a delaying tactic. From Moscow, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports.
Just 3 days ago, Vladimir Putin was named as a war crime suspect by the International Criminal Court. But that didn't stop China's president flying in and shaking his hand. Putin and Xi have met many times before, but never before has Russia's president been under such pressure. His war in Ukraine not going at all according to plan. Xi Jinping called Vladimir Putin his dear friend, his strategic partner. The Kremlin leader said they would discuss China's peace initiative. But there is no detailed Chinese plan to end the war in Ukraine. What Moscow would like from Beijing is lethal aid to help it win. Beijing's been reluctant to provide that to prevent secondary sanctions against Chinese companies. But it has been supplying dual-use technology, like semiconductor chips, that the Russian military can use. The Kremlin also wants to expand trade with China. With Russia under heavy international sanctions, economic ties with Beijing are proving a lifeline. If you burn bridges with the West, as Vladimir Putin has, what do you do then? You look east. That's exactly what the Kremlin leader has done. Recent events have accelerated Russia's dependency on China. Putin and Xi may speak about mutually beneficial cooperation, but Beijing looks increasingly like the senior partner. But Moscow hasn't just partnered with Beijing. Last week, Russia held joint naval exercises with China and Iran. There are signs the Kremlin is looking to forge an anti-Western alliance.
Putin is building his own bloc. He doesn't trust the West anymore. He's looking for allies and trying to make Russia part of a common fortress with China, as well as with India, Latin America and Africa. Putin is building his own anti-Western world.
Now, with Xi Jinping here, Russia can claim that it's not isolated, that Moscow has powerful allies who view the world through a similar lens, that it doesn't need the West if it has friends in the East. But experience shows China always puts China first.
Well, today the talks between the two men begin in earnest. Earlier, I spoke with our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, in Moscow, and I asked him how the visit was being perceived by the Russian public.
You see the word drug, friend, in the headlines on a lot of the papers since both leaders addressed each other as dear friends. Earlier this week, there was a little bit of scepticism. Some commentators saying, well, look, the reality is that China will always defend its national interests first and put itself first. So, yes, you can talk about a bromance, you can talk about a strategic partnership, deepening cooperation between Russia and China. But I think people are open-eyed here and understand that China has its interests at heart first of all. And also there is an understanding that despite the talk of partnership and a no-limits partnership, this is not a partnership of equals anymore. That very much now China is the senior partner here, that Russia is very dependent on China for diplomatic support, political support, and for economic support too. Russia needs Chinese markets since, Russia is under heavy international sanctions right now.
Well, for the view from China, let's go live to Beijing now and speak to our correspondent, Stephen McDonnell. Stephen, take me through the logic of this. Xi Jinping has problems of his own. He's under huge pressure to improve the economy. But China's trade with Russia is relatively small. So how is he improving matters by building up his relationship with Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's a good question, and in some ways it could be making the situation potentially worse. And the reason is that the Chinese government here in Beijing has created this enormous expectation that this peace plan might work. Whereas I think most serious observers do not expect anything of the sort. They don't think that Xi Jinping is going to leave Moscow with a Ukraine war peace deal. And in fact, some would say that it's not even designed to do that. The Chinese government has actually been accused of using this as a bit of a smokescreen to enable the Chinese government to keep trading with Moscow, to keep supporting the Russian government mid-invasion in a way that's palatable. Well, now, at the same time as the day 2 of this state visit, we've got this surprise visit to Ukraine by Japan's Prime Minister. And if Xi Jinping leaves Moscow with nothing, comparisons are going to be made. I mean, people are going to be looking at those two leaders, where they chose to go to, what their priorities are. And I think the person this really puts the pressure on is Xi Jinping.
Stephen, a lot of people have drawn parallels between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and just even the threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Are we getting any signals through what Xi Jinping is saying, what Beijing is saying in terms of how China is viewing Taiwan at this point, whether it's actually considering an invasion, or is it just throwing those ideas out of the water?
Well, the most bleak possibility is that the Chinese government thinks that the war in Ukraine is actually beneficial to it geostrategically, and that's because Russia is doing its dirty work at the moment. It's really taking it up to the West. It's eating up NATO resources at a time when, as you say, China's considering the possibility that it may at some point want to use force to take the island of Taiwan. And so, like I say, there is a pretty dark scenario which would suggest that the Chinese government doesn't quite mind the war in Ukraine, in that it puts all this pressure on the West. The flip side of that, though, is that the West has hung together more tightly than many would have expected. The war hasn't been going well for Russia, considering how long it's gone, and it might make some of the generals in Beijing think twice about what it might mean for this country if they were ever to decide to use force to take Taiwan.
And Stephen, just briefly, how is this visit being portrayed in the Chinese state media and also on Chinese social media?
Well, lots of coverage, of course. We had the letter from Vladimir Putin published in the Renminbi, the main organ of the Communist Party, yesterday, but plenty of articles in state-run press. We've seen it on television here, on the 24-hour news networks, lots of pictures of the two leaders sitting down. Just like in Russia, all this talk of friendship, the two countries coming together. You know, if it wasn't for the war in Ukraine, people would think this is quite a normal visit. I mean, these two countries, they're neighbours. Sure, of course, they want to have good trading relations, and it wouldn't seem that strange. But the fact that both the leaders have been speaking about the war, about peace, that's what's put talk of this potential peace deal front and centre for this state visit by Xi Jinping.
Fascinating. It's great to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you very much, Stephen McDonnell, speaking to us from Beijing.